In 2006, the General Assembly of the UN, as part of the Program of Reform of the United Nations, replaced the UN Human Rights Commission with a newly created Human Rights Council. The Universal Periodic Review is a unique mechanism of the Human Rights Council, aimed at improving the human rights situation on the ground of each of the 193 United Nations member states. Under this mechanism, the human rights situation of all the UN member states is reviewed every 4.5 years. 42 states are reviewed each year during 3 working group sessions dedicated to 14 states each. The result of each review is reflected in an outcome report listing the recommendations the state under review will have to implement before the next review. In late 2007, by system of draw, Bahrain was the very first country to undergo the Universal Periodic Review of the UN Human Rights Council, which took place on April 7, 2008. The UPR is the main mechanism for reviewing each and every member state of the United Nations with regard to the fulfillment by each state of its human rights obligations and commitments.
During the last 4 years, human rights groups and defenders were harassed, defamed, denied access to the media, and legally prosecuted. Many of them were victims of the use of excessive force. Since December 2007, the authorities have staged a crackdown against activists and human rights groups. Human rights defenders were arrested violently at their houses. They were reportedly subjected to severe torture, including the use of electric shocks, hanging, and sexual abuse.
In 2012, Bahrain received 176 recommendations in its second Universal Periodic Review, of which it fully accepted 145 recommendations and partially accepted 13 recommendations. Bahrain asserted in its response to the Universal Periodic Review recommendations that it had dropped all charges related to the freedom of expression and that the authorities have taken steps to investigate past and present human rights abuses. The recommendations Bahrain accepted included more than a dozen, calling on the government to hold security forces accountable for rights abuses, including wrongful deaths and mistreatment of detainees in government custody. Other recommendations called for the immediate release of prisoners convicted solely for exercising their rights to peaceful assembly and free speech during pro-democracy demonstrations in February and March 2011.
We reiterate our commitment to the aims and purpose of this esteemed Council and the United Nations human rights mechanisms, and look forward to ongoing and mutually beneficial cooperation. We also continue to engage constructively with international human rights organizations. My government will return here to present Bahrain's interim progress report during the current UPR cycle. Thank you very much.
So the government always claims that it has implemented more than 90% of the UPR recommendations, as well as the BICI recommendations. But the fact is that the government did not implement UPR recommendations in essence, but indeed committed serious abuses of human rights on larger scale. Bahrain is in serious crisis of human rights since February 2011, with more than 150 persons killed, thousands injured, around 3,500 prosecuted and imprisoned, more than 5,000 arbitrarily dismissed, though majority reinstated, hundreds sought asylum in exile. Public freedoms are constrained, relative democracy demised, and civil society and human rights defenders are under threat. Together with the national CSO's prominent figures including UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Zeid bin Ra'ad Al Hussein, BICI President Sharif Bassiouni, and major international human rights organizations have repeatedly urged the government to stop these abuses and address the political and human crisis through conciliation and implementation of UPR recommendations. Based on a report by Bahrain Human Rights Observatory, we present a brief assessment of selected UPR recommendations implementation in Bahrain. Recommendation 1. Ratification of conventions, lifting reservations and accepting optional protocols. The government did not ratify any conventions nor lifted any reservations. Recommendation 2. Death penalty. Death penalty is not abolished. Recommendation 3. Incorporate into national law Bahrain's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Bahrain's juvenile law was amended to indicate that the parents of anyone under the age of 15 who takes part in demonstration, public gathering, or sit-in would receive a written warning from the Ministry of Interior. If a second offense is recorded within 6 months, the child's father could face jail, a fine, or both. Thus, the amendment puts responsibility on parents instead of protecting children participants in protests. Recommendation 4. Align the national legislation on freedom of expression, association, and assembly with country's international human rights obligation. Bahrain did not align the national legislation on freedom of expression, association, and assembly with country's international human rights obligations. The government even abuses the existing law on assembly and demonstrations by refusing to observe notification for assembly and demonstration, practically banning peaceful assembly and demonstrations. Recommendation 5. Enhance the protection of child rights by issuing the Child Law. Law on Rights of Child was issued but short for rights stipulated in the CRC. Recommendation 6. Amend any article of its penal code that can be used to prosecute individuals for the exercise of the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, or association, and bring its laws into line with international standards established by the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Penal code is toughened. The sentence for the exercise of the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, or association, contrary to international standards established by the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and victims, are in hundreds. Recommendation 7. Facilitate the work and function of the National Human Rights Institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. The National Human Rights Institution does not meet Paris Principles. Recommendation 8. Include opposition parliamentary groups and invite civil society in the implementation of the National Consensus Dialogue. No opposition parliamentary groups exist after the High Civil Court ordered the dissolution of Al-Wifaq opposition group and the liquidation of all its assets. An independent civil society is excluded from dialogue with officials where the so-called National Consensus Dialogue stands as a public relation event where real dialogue is needed. Added to the facts mentioned earlier, the Bahraini government's decision to unilaterally dissolve the largest political opposition bloc in Bahrain, its leader, Sheikh Ali Salman, had his 4 years prison sentence increased to a 9 years prison sentence for calling for democracy. The top religious figure, Sheikh Isa Qasim, had his citizenship revoked and is accused of money laundering for practicing Al-Khums religious ritual. The most prominent human rights defender, Nabil Rajab, was re-arrested for a tweet, and human rights defender Zainab Al-Khawaja was enforced to get out of the country after being jailed with her baby. Friday prayers are prohibited. Over 70 Shiite clerics are being prosecuted. Human rights defenders are imprisoned and are put under travel bans. All that and more proves that the government is committed to repression rather than reform, and committed to violations rather than implementation of any of the UPR's recommendations.